All right. Why are you laughing? So we finished 3:15 and 16. We even touched on 17, and we've talked about 17 in chapter 3 is where we are a number of times throughout. I really do think that 17 is, if there is a key verse in the book, it may be this one. We don't have a verse in Peter that encompasses everything that he's talking about, or that includes a really large variety of the keywords of the book. But this concept in 3:17 really does seem to solidify his main point, which is it's better if God should will it so that you suffer for doing what is right rather than doing what is wrong. We talked about 3:15, and I just want to touch on that again to refresh our context. So often chapter 3:15 is a verse that we suggest people memorize. It's a memory verse that a lot of people know, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account of the hope that's in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. We talked about that being phobos. Reverence should really be fear there. And, that's a great memory verse, but let's not forget the context in which that verse sits. In verse 14, he says, but even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And don't fear their fear. Don't fear their intimidation, those that want to persecute you and make you afraid of them in order to get you to do whatever it is that they want you to do, be it confess Caesar as Lord or denounce Christ or whatever the case may be. Their method of doing that is to threaten you with suffering. That's, I'm going to make you suffer if you don't do what I say. And he says, don't fear their intimidation, don't fear their fear, and do not be troubled, but set Christ apart as Lord in your heart. And that's what it's going to take in those times of difficulty to really get through that suffering, is to have Christ set apart in our lives. And yet be ready to give that defense to those who are threatening you, those who are saying, I'm going to cause you to suffer if you don't do what I say. Then, be ready to make a defense to them. Give an apology is really the word, apologia. Now, we think in our modern language, apology means to say I'm sorry. But an apology is really to make a defense, to give evidence. That's where we get our word apologetics from. When we talk about Christian evidences, we talk about apologetics. One of the big Christian evidences companies in the country, Focus Press, but also Apologetics Press. It's about making an apology, giving an apology. Again, not saying you're sorry, but presenting evidence and giving a defense. And all of that's done out of fear of the Lord. We follow that thought all the way back to chapter 1, verse 17, where he started that concept. And he's brought that idea all the way through this context with submission in these various areas. Chapter 2, verse 13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake. And so it brings us to this idea in verse 17, and he's kind of reaching a climax of this discussion of what it's going to take to survive suffering. He's already given us in chapter 2, verse 21 to 25, our example in suffering, right? Christ was our example, and he gave us 5 or 6 things there in verse 22 and 23 and 24 that Jesus did in the face of suffering, and so he's reminding us that we need to do those things as well. He committed no sin. There was no deceit found in his mouth, those kinds of things. And so we've got to recognize that becomes really important. I just noticed that our camera is weird, and I need to fix it because right now it's cutting my head off, and that won't work for the recording. So I think I need to go. See if I can do this. Somebody moved the dot and tell me it just stopped. No, it's not going to let me. So, oh well. Smell the floor. Yeah, just go. Get lower. I don't know if that's going to work. But it might. Okay, sorry. So we have verse 17, for it is better if God should will it so that you suffer for doing what is right rather than doing what is wrong. For verse 18, and this is kind of where we left off, for Christ also died for sins once for all. Now it's really interesting, and you guys know this, especially a couple of you that did your word study on suffering. This is that word, pasco. He suffered. I hate that they translated it died. I mean, that was part of the suffering. But the point that Peter's making is, notice in verse 14, even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And then in verse 17, it's better that you suffer for doing what is right. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the just for the unjust. You see, a just man suffered for doing what is right. He was just. He was righteous. And yet it still caused him to suffer, because men sometimes are not going to allow a righteous man not to suffer. They don't care about that. And so he again is cited as our example in suffering, that he suffered for sins once for all. He was the ultimate sacrifice for our sin. He's the ultimate example of suffering for doing what's right. Hebrews tells us that he was tempted in every way just as we are, yet without sin. I mean, there was no fault at all in him. Now, we can't say that, can we? I mean, as much as we strive to do what's right and be righteous, we can't say we were sinless. But certainly he can. And yet he still suffered. So if he was sinless and suffered, why would we expect that being not sinless, we wouldn't suffer? But he was that sacrifice once for all. He suffered for doing what's right, and he was just. He did what was right, and he suffered for it because of the unjust. Now, it's interesting that the words here, the just is singular, and the unjust is plural. He died, he suffered for all of those who are unjust. So that, we've got that Hina again, so that he might bring us to God. The reason that he was willing to suffer, there was a purpose behind the suffering. And really, isn't that, in essence, what Peter has been saying the whole time about suffering? There's a purpose behind suffering. Not a purpose to the suffering, but there's an outcome, I guess I should say. There's a result that we're looking to, even if it causes us to suffer. And that's what happens afterwards. Christ was our example in suffering, and yet he was glorified by God. Here he reminds us of the fact that Christ suffered so that he might bring us to God, so that we might become part of that kingdom and part of that inheritance. Now it's interesting, in Matthew 27:51, we have the account of the veil of the temple being torn at his death. That really was a visual manifestation, if you will, of what that meant for Jesus to be able to bring us to God. Prior to that, in the temple, there was a specific place for the priests to go to offer sacrifice and to be in the presence of the Lord. And when Jesus died on the cross, that veil was torn from top to bottom. That separation between us and God was done away with. Jesus' sacrifice brought us to God. Now, we saw a hint of that back in chapter 2, verse 5, when he said that we are living stones who are being built up into this spiritual house for a holy priesthood. We are that spiritual house where that holy priesthood takes place. It's not the temple anymore. There's not this division between Christians and God. We are our own priesthood, if you will. To remember, he said to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And so that veil of the temple has been torn. It's been done away with. And Christ suffered. Christ was willing to suffer for doing what was right, so that might be the case for us, that we might have that access and be able to be brought near to him, to be brought to God. And he says, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Now, this is the first phrase that we have that's kind of a challenge. The construction here is pretty interesting. He says that he, having been put to death in the flesh. the construction here is really a dative construction, and it's a men-day construction. You've got the word men and day, and depending on what you remember from your Greek class, men is on the one hand, and day is on the other. So he's, in essence, what he's saying is, on the one hand, he was put to death in the flesh, but on the other hand, he was made alive in the spirit. You know, that contrast is going on here. And also, we have to recognize that there is no definite article here for the word sarx or the word pneuma. The word flesh and spirit here doesn't have a definite article. They're dative nouns. And the idea behind the dative could be instrumental in this case. And that seems, is Will teaching that dative is broken into three? You've got dative, locative, and instrumental, or just dative?
Just dative.
Okay. Kind of an older school 8-case view of Greek was that dative actually has some different perspectives, one of which is instrumental case and the other was locative. And it seems that this dative is really more instrumental in the way it's constructed. Having been put to death in flesh, or by means of the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Now, we're not there yet, but he uses this exact same construction in chapter 4, verse 6. Jump over to chapter 4, verse 6 real quickly. And you'll notice that he says, "For the gospel has for this purpose been preached, even to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh," and that's the exact same construction. It's that dative with no definite article. "Though they are judged in flesh as men, they may live in spirit according to the will of God." So it seems as though what he's saying is that Jesus was put to death in flesh, or by means of flesh. Now, there's two ways we can look at that. One is he's just referring to his physical body, and that physical body was put to death. That's why they translate the word suffer, pasco, in verse 18, died, because that is ultimately what that suffering amounted to, was that he died. But he was put to death by means of the flesh. Now, there is a group of folks that looks at this and says, what he's saying is that he was put to death by men. He was judged by men, and men put him to death. He was put to death by means of the flesh, that dative that's an instrumental case. The flesh was the instrument by which he was put to death. Now, that makes a little bit more sense in this context, especially given what he says in chapter 4, verse 6. He is saying in chapter 4, verse 6, that those that are now dead were judged in flesh as men. They lived their life and they were judged in flesh, by means of the flesh as men, and were made to live in spirit according to the will of God. So that may be the best construction here, is the idea of that instrumental case in the dative. But either way, what he's saying is he was put to death in body, in flesh, but made alive in spirit. Now, we know that if he was just talking about his resurrection, we know that his resurrection was physical. We know Thomas touched his body, touched the wounds in his hands and in his side. I mean, he ate breakfast. He just wasn't a ghost walking around, is the point. But there's a reason that Peter's stressing here the spiritual aspect, and that's because that's what we need to be focused on. That's that long-term perspective that we need to have. It's about our spiritual life, not just our fleshly life, right? If we're going to get through suffering, we need to be thinking more about our spiritual life than we are thinking about our physical life. That's this idea going all the way back to chapter 1, verse 13. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. That's a spiritual perspective of our life, isn't it? I need to worry more about what's going to happen on into eternity spiritually than I need to worry about what's going to happen to me physically. And he's going to use this idea that Jesus was put to death in flesh but made alive in spirit to talk about how Jesus has always been concerned about the salvation of men's souls, going all the way back to the time of Noah and the flood. And this is where we get into an interesting kind of situation here. He says, in which, and this is a bad verse break, unfortunately, he might bring us to Christ, having been put to death in flesh, but made alive in spirit, in which he also went and made proclamation to the spirits in prison. So it was in spirit that Jesus went and made proclamation to the spirits who are now in prison. Now, this phrase gives a lot of people some heartburn, and it's difficult. There's no doubt about it. But if we think it logically through, I think we can come out the other side pretty clear on what he's talking about. Who are these spirits in prison?
Those on the earth without God.
Don't stop at verse 19.
Oh, we're talking about Noah's preaching to the ones before the flood?
Okay.
Talking about?
So who are these spirits in prison that in spirit Jesus went and preached to?
He preached in spirit through Noah.
Okay, but to who?
Preached to the people on the earth.
What does the verse say?
I'm not reading. Apparently I'm not reading.
To those who were once disobedient, when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah, right? So again, this is a phrase where you really got to be careful not to stop at the end of a verse and try to make an explanation. You kind of got to see it all the way through verse 19 and 20. And actually verse 18, 19, and 20 needs to be looked at kind of as a group. He was made alive in spirit, in which, in that spirit, he went and made proclamation to spirits. Now, the New American Standard added the word now. I don't know if the ESV adds the word now or not. The New King James does not.
And what verse?
We're in verse 19.
For the now. So the now they put it in 19?
Yeah, we added now. The New American Standard added now. Spirits now in prison? How does the ESV say it?
In which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison.
Okay, spirits in prison is right. The now is trying to help clarify, but it's been added as an interpretation, not as a translation. So we need to be aware of the New American Standard. And the now shows up in the NAS as an italicized word. It tells us that the translators added it. But he went and made proclamation to the spirits in prison who once were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark. So at some point in time, Jesus went and made a proclamation, preached basically, to spirits in prison. Those were the spirits that were disobedient during the time of Noah and the construction of the ark. You follow? Now, Catholicism tells us that this proclamation occurred during the 3 days between his death and his resurrection. They put him in the tomb. During those 3 days, he went down into the Hadean realm and preached to those in purgatory. And depending on who you talk to, liberated some from purgatory and brought them with him into heaven. Problem with that is that if this is the 3 days, Jesus didn't go straight to heaven, did he? He went, let's just think through their logic for just a second. He went down into Hades, preached in purgatory. First of all, we already understood problem number one is there is no purgatory.
Yeah.
But he preached to those in purgatory, liberated some, released their souls to heaven, and then made a detour back to earth to do his thing here before he did his resurrection. That's the mindset. But we have a number of problems with that, obviously. One is why only preach to those who were disobedient during the time of the construction of the ark? Let's just say for a second that purgatory is real. Okay, we don't believe that, but let's just say for a second that purgatory is a real place. This is saying that Jesus in spirit went and preached, made a proclamation only to those who were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark. Now, what about all those other souls that throughout the centuries after the construction of the ark are now in purgatory? What logical proclamation would Jesus make just to those who were disobedient during the time of Noah that he wouldn't make to anyone else who is in purgatory at the time of this preaching? Do you see? That's a serious problem. I mean, why only select? I mean, Scripture says God is not he's not partial, right? He's not the word's just not going to come to me. Respecter of persons. So if he wants all men to be saved, why, if there's an opportunity to make a proclamation to those who are in this Hadean realm, why wouldn't he make it to everyone who's in this Hadean realm? Why only to those who were disobedient during the days of Noah? Certainly there were plenty of other people disobedient. We have all of the prophets. We have all of the books of the Old Testament that talk about the disobedience of Israel long after the flood, who would have died in persecution, would have died in captivity, would have died due to the wrath of God, just like they did during the flood. Why not offer them a second chance? Why do only the people of Noah's time get a second chance? Well, Scripture never talks about, there's nothing in Scripture anywhere that would indicate that. And as a matter of fact, we do have the account that Jesus gave of the rich man and Lazarus, where it was said very clearly that there is a chasm fixed between these two places, and no one can cross from one to the other. At death, it seems that our fate is fixed. And so if Jesus did in spirit go preach during the 3 days he was in the tomb, again, they have to reasonably answer why only to those who were disobedient during the time that Noah was building the ark. Secondly, why did these people get a visit from Jesus to begin with? I mean, it doesn't say anything. This passage doesn't say. All it says is he went and made proclamation to those who are now in prison, those who are in prison. It doesn't say what he proclaimed. It doesn't say what he taught. It doesn't say anything about liberating them from prison. It simply says that he made a proclamation to them. Now, we can look at the word proclamation, and we can certainly get some indication of maybe what he's talking about. When we look at that word proclamation, it's just part of the verb there, and it's a karux. It means to preach. What we would hope to see here is maybe that euangelion word, where he preached the good news to them, but he didn't. That's not what the verse says. It says that he simply made proclamation to those now in prison. So what was the purpose for this proclamation? The Catholics have taken it to the point, well, he proclaimed to them so that they could leave that Hadean realm. But the verse doesn't say that anywhere. This whole context doesn't say that anywhere. And then third, of course, obviously, is what would that proclamation be to those in Hades? Certainly, we've seen from the rich man and Lazarus account that Abraham didn't offer any proclamation to the rich man. He said, once you're there, and there's no way to cross from there to here or here to there. And so this explanation of what's happening here just doesn't satisfy the context of the passage. There's really no way for Jesus to go and have made some proclamation only to a select group of people within the Hadean realm in order to liberate them from that Hadean realm without being a respecter of persons, without choosing only those people as having the opportunity for a second chance. And why is it that they would get a second chance and no one else? So that would make God seem unfair, especially from the standpoint of Scripture says nothing about anyone ever getting a second chance. So if that's not the case, what is the case? What is he talking about? Now, yeah.
This also makes Jesus a liar, because he told the thief on the cross he'd be in paradise with him today.
Well, but why would that make Jesus alive?
Did you say this is right after he's died, right on the cross? He's
So
been
he
down
would
and
have
preached
went
3
to
days.
not paradise.
Yeah. Well, but see, here's what Catholicism does with that. They move the comma. I say to you today, comma, you will be with me in paradise.
Right.
The today is modifying when the statement was said, not when the thief will be with him in paradise. They believe that by moving that comma, Jesus was saying, you're going to have to do a stint in purgatory, but ultimately you will be with me in paradise.
Right.
I'm making this statement today,
Right.
that you will be with me in paradise. Instead of, I'm making this statement that today you will be with me in paradise.
Ah.
So, but see, once you start down this purgatory road, you're forced into those kinds of situations.
Sure.
That's the problem that you have is once you go through, you're kind of forced to make those modifications to the text. But you're right. I mean, if we take that verse the way we take that verse,
Right.
it would make Jesus a liar. And now there are some that would suggest that because it was Jesus the Lord. I know that I had this argument with nuns in high school. I went to Catholic high school, by the way, and one finally told me that because Jesus was Lord, he circumvented the thief's stint in purgatory. He just said, you get to go straight to paradise because you're a nice guy.
Yeah, I'm not going.
Right. But I'll catch you there later, kind of thing. So,
All right.
time, the argument was time to the Lord at that point is irrelevant. It's not,
Right.
today is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like, that kind of argument. So, the purgatory argument just doesn't fit the context, and we can see that. You've got to keep in mind that these spirits that this proclamation was made to are those who were disobedient during the patience of God, waiting in the days of Noah. That's the group we're talking about. So who is it, how is it that Christ, in spirit, made a proclamation to those who are now in prison, or in prison? Well, Peter said in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. And we know that Noah preached for the entire time of the construction of the ark. When we look in the Old Testament, it took him over 100 years to build the ark. So, and the whole time he was preaching righteousness. So it seems that what Peter is saying is that in spirit, by means of spirit, Jesus went and through the righteous preaching of Noah, preached to those who are now in prison. That's why the translators have added this now, is they are, in the context, when Peter writes, these people are now in prison, but in the past, Jesus went in spirit through Noah and made proclamation to them and offered them some hope. And it was during that time, when those people were being disobedient, when the patience of God kept waiting. See, I think that's part of our clue, is that there was a proclamation made to those who are disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting. For 100 years, God waited. And only 8 people obeyed the message. And so it was through the patience of God, waiting during the construction of the ark, that this message was preached, and Jesus was involved in that preaching. Now, that shouldn't surprise us when we go back to chapter 1. If you remember when we talked about those prophets of old, in chapter 1, verse 11, it said these prophets, verse 10, were making careful searches and inquiries, seeking to know what person or time the Spirit of Christ within them was indicating, as he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the glories to follow. Jesus was directly involved in inspiring those prophets to write and predict the sufferings of the Christ and the glories that were to follow. Well, it appears that the point that Peter's making here is that same Spirit, in spirit, Christ through the prophet of Noah. We don't often call Noah a prophet, but that's certainly what he was. He was speaking on behalf of God. Was speaking through Noah during that time when God was patiently waiting for people to respond to the message. And he says, in which only a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. So this preaching of Noah worked, but only for 8 people. But what was the outcome for Noah and his family? They were saved. Why? They listened to the proclamation. They did what was right. Now, the context doesn't tell us what suffering Noah went through. But the context of this passage is about this idea of suffering, right? He had just said it's better to suffer for doing what's right than doing what's wrong. Christ suffered for sins once for all, and he goes and then talks about this situation with Noah. Certainly, the hardship for Noah in preaching for 100 years, context doesn't tell us, the scriptures don't tell us, but certainly there must have been some persecution to Noah. The people were not listening to him. They were not obeying. They remained disobedient, even though he was preaching. But the outcome, Peter's not so much concerned about what happens to the evil people. He's been making that point throughout the book and will continue to make that point. The evil people, remember when we look earlier in the chapter, the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, his ears attend to their prayer, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil, chapter 3, verse 12. He's not so much concerned here with what happened to the evil people, but what happened to the righteous ones. The righteous ones were saved. They were brought safely through the water. So they may have had to deal with some suffering, but they were saved. Now, notice that it says that they were brought safely through the water. Now, this word brought, diasozo, is that word saved. And so it literally means saved through. They were saved through the water. Now, I thought they were saved by the ark. Weren't they saved by the ark? I mean, they got on the ark and they were saved, right?
If they weren't in the ark, they would have drowned.
But notice how he says this. This is to me is pretty cool. They were brought safely through the water. Now, he's not talking about the instrument that brought them through. He's talking about the water. What is it that the water did in the flood?
Washed away
all the sin.
It washed away all the sin and all the evil. There was a separation made when God decided that he was going to flood the earth. He washed away all the evil. And Noah and his family were brought safely through that water. You see, it's not about the ark. He simply mentions the construction of the ark to set the time frame. But the 8 people were actually brought safely through the water. God used water as the instrument to cleanse the earth. And he washed everything away that was evil and saved only those that were righteous, only those that were pure of heart, only those that had obeyed what he said. They did what was right. They did what God wanted them to do. They were righteous. Peter describes Noah as righteous Noah. And that, you see how that fits what he's been talking about. It's important for us to do what's right. If we do what's right, God will save us. God will take care of us. Just like he did with Noah. He saved Noah and the 8 persons on the ark. Because he brought them through the water. And so verse 21, corresponding to that event, corresponding to that occasion in which God used water to wash away evil and separate the righteous, corresponding to that event, baptism now saves you. You see, Peter's concerned about explaining the water and the use of he's not talking about the ark. He doesn't say that they were saved by water. We're not saved by water either. The water is what God uses to wash away the iniquity, to wash away the evil. We're saved by the grace of God. We're saved by the forgiveness of our sins and entering into that relationship with Him. So we got to be real careful when we describe baptism. We're not saved by the water. We're brought through the water. And isn't that what Romans chapter 6 would talk about? We're buried with Him in baptism in water and raised. We're brought through that water to be raised in new life. Free of all of that sin and all of that evil that got washed away. All of our sins get washed away. We bury that old man of sin in that watery grave, but we are brought safely through the water to live in newness of life. And that's the idea that Peter's getting across to them right here. Just like Jesus' preaching during the time of Noah needed to be responded to. And 8 people responded. They did what was right. They followed what God said. And they were brought safely through the water. We too now are brought safely through the water in baptism. It's corresponding to that event that baptism saves you. Not the removal of dirt from the flesh. It has nothing to do with getting in and washing any dirt off our skin. It's about that appeal to God for a good conscience. Now, he just talked about this good conscience. He talked about it in verse 16. We need to keep a good conscience by acting, giving a defense in gentleness and fear of the Lord, right? It's in that time of suffering that we respond and we keep a good conscience in giving that defense. Yeah.
So he starts talking about in verse 18, he's talking to the whole audience. Christ suffered, and you need to suffer. He left you the example. Is this like a huge rabbit chase he's doing right here?
It seemed, I don't know how huge it is, but it does seem to be an opportunity that he's taking to talk about suffering of Christ and what that suffering was involved in, and then how that relates to baptism. And then he's going to come back to it. So in my mind it does, because look at chapter 4, verse 1.
Yeah.
Therefore, since Christ has suffered in flesh. I mean, he's coming right back to that idea of Christ suffered in flesh, but was made alive in the Spirit. Now he's talking about what Christ did in spirit, all the way back to Noah's time, and how that affected Noah and his family and brought them safely through the water, and corresponds that to baptism now, doing what's right now in order to be saved. And then he goes back to that idea of Christ suffering in the flesh. It's a rabbit chase to some degree, but here's my interpretation. What he's trying to remind them is that the spiritual is more important than the fleshly. And it's always been that way. Going all the way back to the time of Noah, the people were continuously evil. But they thought fleshly. The only ones that didn't think fleshly were Noah and his family. They thought spiritually. They thought about the fact that God said he's going to flood the world. We've never seen rain before. And he says he's going to flood the whole world with water coming from the sky, and we've never even seen that before. It certainly took some belief, some trust in God. It took a spiritual perspective in order to follow what God said. Those 8 people did that, and they were saved. We have to also have that spiritual perspective. Well, where do we demonstrate that spiritual perspective first? In baptism. It's a physical act, but it's something that's responding to a spiritual focus. It's what reminds us, going back to chapter 1, of fixing our hope completely on the grace to be brought at the revelation of Jesus Christ. We obey, we allow ourselves to be brought safely through the water, not because of any physical thing. It's not some physical thing like washing dirt off our body. It's a spiritual thing. You follow? So, while I agree that it feels like a rabbit chase, I see it as this spiritual lesson that he's making in the middle of this fleshly discussion. Having that spiritual perspective is what saved the people in Noah's time. It's what's going to save you through baptism. And then he's going to come back to that idea of what we do in the flesh in order to respond in righteousness to God.
I think preachers do this when they're preaching. I mean, you go back and remind them of this. See, this is what I'm talking about, but this is relevant here.
Right.
Remember this? You remember this.
The hard part here, though, is the connection, is the transition from 18 to 19. You know, it seems like he's being very clear to me about it's better to suffer for doing what's right rather than suffer for doing what's wrong. Christ suffered too. And now all of a sudden we're talking about what Christ did in spirit all the way back at the time of Noah. And that seems like a big jump. I mean, how do we get there from here? Why is that the connection? Well, I think that's what really leads me to believe that verse 18 is talking about that instrumental case in the dative. He was made alive by means of the Spirit, and it's by means of the Spirit that we are going to be made alive through baptism. It's by means of the Spirit that Noah and the 8 were saved, because they had a spiritual perspective on things, not just a physical perspective on things. And so when we get to chapter 4, verse 6, he also says that we may live in spirit according to the will of God. It's that idea that throughout history, those that have responded in spirit and lived according to the will of God have been saved.
Right. So it makes the transition a lot smoother too.
I don't know that it makes the transition a whole lot smoother to me. I mean, that jump in 18 and 19 has always been a challenge. I mean, he just kind of all of a sudden goes, Christ suffered, but then he taught Noah way back when in spirit, and then he walks us through what baptism is. Now, I've read commentaries that say he used this as an opportunity to say what the purpose of baptism was. Well, I'm not buying that. I mean, certainly he does make that connection, but why is baptism important to those who are suffering? I mean, that's the immediate context, and it's the context he's going to come right back to. He uses the term suffering twice in verse 4 verse 1. And he says, so arm yourself for the same purpose to suffer as Christ did. So it does seem to me to be a little bit of a rabbit chase. I mean, he is talking about one thing. He mentions Christ being raised or made alive by means of the Spirit. And that's an opportunity for him to say, Jesus has always, in spirit, gone all the way back, proclaimed the gospel during Noah's time, and it was in spiritual response that Noah responded and was saved. It's in a spiritual response that we respond. Because that's why I think he makes the point, not the removal of dirt from the flesh. There are too many people that are like, well, what's so special about the water? Well, it has absolutely zero to do with the water. The only thing that it has to do with the water is that God used water as the instrument, just like he did with Noah, to cleanse the earth. Well, he's still using water as that cleansing medium to separate the righteous from the unrighteous and wash that old man of sin away. Yeah.
I think it should also be noted that in the NIV, they do a terrible job of translating this verse in particular, because it says not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God.
Right.
Almost makes it seem like, well, you already have a clear conscience. This is just the symbolic act.
Well, the word there is ace.
Yeah.
Into a good conscience. It's a pledge into a good conscience. And see, again, he's making a difference in this little parenthetical statement in the middle of this phrase. Note verse 21 real carefully. Look at the construction in the English even of verse 21. Corresponding to that, talking about Noah, baptism now saves you. Now, in the New American Standard, they actually separate it with hyphens. Then you have this clause, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience. Remove that for just a second. That's a dependent clause. But if we take that out, notice what it says. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's how baptism saves us. It's through the resurrection. It's because Christ, again, talk about connecting to Romans chapter 6. But Christ was resurrected, and it's through that resurrection that we are saved by means of the water, brought safely through the water. It's through the resurrection. Christ was buried in the tomb and was raised out of that tomb. We're buried in the water. We're raised out of that tomb. But then this parenthetical statement contrasts the flesh and the spiritual. Not the removal of dirt from the flesh. It has nothing to do with your physical body getting in the water, but an appeal to God for a good conscience. An appeal to God for that spirituality, that focus on the spiritual, which is what he said back in chapter 3, verse 16. We need to keep a good conscience in these things by keeping our behavior excellent, by giving an account in responding in fear of the Lord to keeping a good conscience. Well, we make a pledge for a good conscience, or pledge into a good conscience when we're baptized. Now, how is it that we get this good conscience through baptism?
Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Okay, so what does that mean for us? I mean, what do we do in baptism that is a pledge or an appeal to God for a good conscience or into a good conscience? Yeah, I mean, we have that idea of dying to self. We have that idea of putting that. I mean, when we go into the waters of baptism, we're saying we're going to put that old man of sin away, aren't we? I mean, if we understand anything about baptism when we submit to it, we understand that through this process, we are going to be cleansed of that old man of sin. That those sins are going to be washed away, and we're going to be raised to walk in new life without all those sins with us. And the pledge that we're making, confessing Jesus as Master, confessing Jesus as Lord when we do that, is that when we come up out of that water, we have a good conscience now. We don't have to take all that old baggage with us. We don't have to worry about all those sins are gone. They're done away with. Now, we may have some new ones that come down the road that we struggle with, that we may have to deal with, or we may still hold on to some of those old ones. But at the time that we are saved through baptism, we're asking God to cleanse our conscience. Give me a good conscience. I want to get rid of all of this baggage that I'm bringing to my spiritual life, all those sins and all that evil that I've been doing. I want to stop doing that, and I want that all to be gone. And he promises that as he washes that away from us, that he will give us a good conscience. We're raised to walk in new life. We should have the perspective when we come up out of the waters of baptism that we're not dragging that old body of sinful man around with us. It's gone. Now, unfortunately, quite often we do drag that old man of sin around. We don't forgive ourselves, even though God has. But that's why it's an appeal to God for a good conscience, not a fleshly thing, not a removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a spiritual cleansing, a spiritual good conscience, that idea that we don't have to worry about that relationship with our old man of sin anymore. And so I think that's what this rabbit chase is about. It's about this contrast between the flesh and the spirit. Yeah.
I seem to remember when we were in Romans, I'm specifically talking about this appeal, filio, that Denny explained to us the calling on the name of the Lord was a servant. Their master would say, you need to go now do this, 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 and this. They would go do it, and they would come back, and then they would request, they would make an appeal to their master, now will you whatever. And that's what we do, and that's what this verse is talking about. We can then, once we have done God's requirements, I could be crazy. This is stuck in my brain for some reason. Then we could go back and request, appeal to God, now may I be saved. Have you done what I've required? Yes, sir. You're saved now.
I don't have a problem with the first part of that. I struggle a little with what I'm hearing in the second part, because I don't know that after baptism we ask and he says, yes, I'll save you.
No, it's up to.
Right, well, and I think what Peter's saying here is the baptism is that request. That submission to that physical act is you've told me, God, that you're going to do this if I do this, right? So I'm going to make that request. And the way I'm going to make it isn't with my mouth. I mean, we confess Jesus. But I'm not going to ask for my sins to be forgiven by asking. I'm going to make that appeal to a good conscience by submitting to baptism. I'm going to allow myself to be immersed. That's my request. you've said that if I get in the water, that you're going to wash this away. Okay, I'm asking for that. Now, how do you ask for it?
You do it.
You do it. I mean, especially if you're James, what we just looked at in James, be doers of the word, right? So I think that's the request. I think the request is the physical action.
But it's spiritually focused.
Absolutely, and that's this contrast between the flesh and the spirit that he's making.
So I endure not because it's fun and it's all about the physical. I'm looking towards the spiritual.
Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ.
All of that makes sense.
Our appeal in baptism is a long-term view of life, isn't it? I mean, it's a long-term view of eternity. We're no longer just thinking about the temporal life that's in front of us. When we make this appeal in baptism to be saved, have those sins washed away, that appeal to a good conscience is for an eternal view, not to a physical view of what's just going to happen over the next number of months, weeks, or years. You follow? It's a spiritual focus, and that's the contrast that I think Peter's doing here. Now, I struggle with the transition into that in 18 and 19, but he is making the contrast in 18 that Christ was put to death by means of the flesh, made alive by means of the Spirit. Well, how are we made alive by means of the Spirit? Through responding the way Noah did to the preaching in Noah's time. We respond to that same preaching in our time through that spiritual appeal, having not the physical, the fleshly focus, but that spiritual focus. It's challenged, there's no doubt. And I wish I saw a smoother transition in 18 and 19 into that thought. But the fact that he says that he makes that contrast between the flesh and the spirit in baptism brings us back to that idea. And then the fact that he's going to talk about what it means to suffer by means of flesh, but arm ourselves to do that in 4:1, and then by the time he gets to 4:6, talking about the fact that we are made alive, we may live in spirit according to the will of God is really the goal. Any other questions about that section? I think the biggest things we need to take out of this is, one, we need to be able to argue against the Catholic view that this occurred during the time of Jesus' internment in the tomb, during those 3 days. Be cognizant of the argument of why only preach to those who were disobedient during that time. It's a powerful argument, and I've yet to have too many Catholics who even understand the concept argue that very well. So that, and that is the context that he puts this in. And then secondly, how does baptism connect with that idea of Noah's time? Well, a lot of people say, well, Noah was saved by the ark. Well, and the reason they say that is because I've heard Christians say, well, we're saved by the waters of baptism. No, we're not. Now, that water is the instrument that God used to cleanse the earth. It's the instrument that he uses now. But baptism is what saves us, because in baptism we're safely brought through that water. The ark was the instrument that was used to bring them safely through the water, but the point that Peter's making is that they were brought safely through the water. Water was the dividing line. Water is the dividing line now. Those on the wrong side of the water in Noah's time drowned and were found to be in prison in the Hadean realm now, but Noah was saved. Those that are on the wrong side of the dividing line of water with baptism are also going to find themselves in prison as opposed to being saved. And so the contrast there is there. But notice, baptism now saves you through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He tells us how it is that baptism saves us. Romans 6, 1 through 11 certainly makes that connection. When we look back at verse 18, Christ died for sins once for all, the just, so that he might bring us to God. And so it's through the resurrection of Jesus Christ that baptism has the opportunity to save us. If Jesus was never resurrected, then we've got no hope in baptism. There is no resurrection. Paul said that. If there's no resurrection, you are still in your sins. Period. But Christ has been raised. And since he has been raised, the promise is that we will be too. Who is at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers had been subjected to him. You see, it was through the resurrection that Jesus has the opportunity to sit at the right hand of God. This is possible because baptism can now save us through the resurrection, because Jesus now has that place of authority. But the reason he has that place of authority is because he's been raised. It is through his resurrection that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. We saw that in Matthew 28:18, right? It wasn't until after his resurrection that he told the disciples, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Well, it was through his obedience, his righteousness, his willing to suffer, even though it was going to cost him his life. It was through that he received that authority and he received that power. And having gone through that suffering, God appointed him as head over all things, after angels and authorities and powers had been subjected to him. Everything had been put under his feet at that point in time. And if everything is under the feet of Christ through his resurrection, then he will save those who submit to baptism, submit to that appeal to God for a good conscience, in doing what is right, even though it may cost us to suffer. We have to be willing to suffer, but not forget that long-term view of things. That even though Christ suffered, he was given all of this power and authority because he went through that suffering and did what was right. He remained righteous, and God rewarded him, subjecting everything to him. Well, the same thing is true for us. We have to be willing to endure some of that suffering in order to be glorified out the other side. And that goes all the way back to chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. In this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials, so that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Hold on to that spiritual worldview. Don't fall back into the fleshly worldview, because the fleshly worldview is going to get really scary. Roman soldiers are going to point very sharp swords at you. And if all you're thinking about is fleshliness, you're going to give up the most precious thing you have. And the most precious thing you have right now is your salvation, that inheritance. So therefore, and he brings back the idea that since we understand that baptism now saves us through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that it's not a fleshly thing, it's a spiritual thing, and that it's through the authority that Jesus now has because of his resurrection, because of his suffering, because he was willing to die for sins once for all and take care of that for everyone. Therefore, since Christ has suffered in flesh, by means of flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose. Literally, and you, in the same way of thinking, equip yourself to suffer. He suffered. You need to understand that straight up, and you need to be prepared for it yourself. Because he who has suffered in flesh has ceased from sin. Well, following a difficult passage about the time of Noah and everything else, we have this phrase that is another challenge. He who has suffered in flesh has ceased from sin. What does that mean? Does it mean if we're willing to suffer, we aren't sinners anymore? Can't go there, can we?
Would it mean that,
Living in sin?
That's part of it. Go ahead,
I
Ron.
was thinking, if they were living according to the Bible, wanting to please the Roman government, they would not suffer in the first place. But because they choose not to, they would.
Okay, so how does that, what effect does that have on sin in their life? Because the point that he makes is that we need to have the same thinking, we have to arm our minds, we have to have that same purpose in mind, that Christ suffered in the flesh, because he who suffered in flesh has ceased from sin. What is that connection with our willingness to suffer in sin? Chris?
Perhaps, I'm thinking, if we're at the point where we know and are willing to die for the fact of, we believe that Christ came and he died and we're willing to die for that fact, and we realize that how sin affects us in our lives, and if we're willing to die for Christ, then shouldn't that make us not want to sin as well?
I think you're right, Adam. It's the idea that once we have that, what's the matter, Scott?
Go ahead. I'm sure you'll make me understand.
Once we have that spiritual perspective rather than the fleshly perspective, once we change our minds to see our life more in the spiritual, even though we understand, even though we've armed ourselves to suffer, we now understand and value the spiritual so much that we're prepared to suffer for it. Sin loses its appeal, doesn't it? Why? Because I understand the value of eternity now. I understand the value of everything that he said in chapter 1. I get the inheritance. I get that God's watching over me. I get that God's going to take care of me in the long run. And even if it causes me to suffer now for a little while at the hands of men, I'm willing to do that rather than give up that eternity. Well, what is sin? Sin is those things that are going to keep me away from that eternity. And they don't have the appeal that they had anymore. It's kind of like Joseph. We look at Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Now, I don't remember specifically if the text says that Potiphar's wife was attractive. But let's face it, men and women and sexual temptation are certainly an issue. But what was Joseph's perspective? I can't do this thing and sin against my God. I can't do it. Now, it doesn't mean that he wasn't attracted to her. It doesn't mean that she wasn't pretty and appealing. It just lost its appeal to him because he had a spiritual perspective that said, if I do this thing, I'm going to harm my relationship. I'm going to harm my spiritual life. I'm going to be in jeopardy of losing my relationship with God. That makes this sin have so much less appeal.
You saw the hook.
Yeah, exactly. He saw the hook. And so it's the idea that he who has suffered in the flesh, now, not just willing to suffer. Notice what it says. He who has suffered in flesh. There's a big difference between saying, I'm willing to suffer for my faith, and actually suffering for your faith. Don't you think? What's the difference?
Say that again.
What's the difference between saying I'm willing to suffer for my faith and actually suffering for my faith?
Well, one, you haven't gone through it yet, and talk is cheap. The next one, you put your money where your mouth is.
And if I have gone to that extreme, because that's what it says, he who has suffered has ceased sin. He who is willing, it's not just, it's time to walk the talk. You say, I would die for my wife. Well, that's really easy for us in the year 2013 to say about our wives, isn't it? Mainly because nobody's pointing a sword at us and saying, are you willing to die for your wife? Right? It's really easy to say it. It's much harder to actually do it. Now, we say it. I believe that we would do it, but we don't know that until that test. Until that point in time where we're put to that test to either sin or suffer. Right? Sin, by rejecting God and doing whatever the persecution demands of us, forgetting our spiritual condition and turning ourselves into that fleshly focus, whatever the demands, whatever the intimidation is that we're being asked to do, I now have to choose sin or suffer. Well, if I choose suffer, it tells me that sin has much less power in my life at this point, doesn't it? It doesn't say that it'll stop them from ever sinning. It simply says that the one who has suffered has ceased from sin. He stopped the power of sin. There are some that say they've stopped the influence of sin. Now, those words aren't in the translation, but that's the idea. Notice what he says in verse 2. Connect the thought of stopping sin with verse 2. If he suffers in the flesh, has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in flesh, no longer for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. You see that dividing line of sin or suffer? You know, I mean, choose what you want. You either sin and denounce God, you do what's wrong in God's eyes, and spare yourself the suffering, or you're willing to suffer for doing what's right. Well, I'm going to suffer for doing what's right. You see, I'm telling myself, I'm committing to live the rest of my time in this fleshly body. Now, it may only be 5 more minutes if the Roman soldier's there with a sword, but however much time I have left, the rest of the time in flesh is no longer for the lusts of men. It's not for sin. It's not for Caesar. It's not to satisfy the Romans. It is for the will of God. I'm going to do what he wants for the rest of the time that I have in this flesh. I'm going to conduct myself in fear during the time of my stay on earth. However long that is going to be, the rest of my time in flesh is going to be committed to doing the will of God. You see, once we reach the point where we're willing to suffer to do that, our perspective is where Peter wants it to be. He's saying, sin is going to have much less power over you. Because now you understand. You've gone through the suffering in order to be with Christ, in order to be with God, to do his will. And you believe it to the point where you're willing to sacrifice in order to show that you're going to do what's right in God's eyes, regardless of the suffering that comes. But it doesn't say because he who is willing to suffer. It's the man who has suffered in the flesh, for doing what's right, has ceased the power of sin in his life. Because now he sees the rest of his life is committed to the will of God, not to the lusts of men. For the time is already past. The time already past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desires of the Gentiles, having pursued a course of sensuality and lust and drunkenness and carousing and drinking parties and abominable idolatries. All of that sinful, whatever amount of time you've spent in your life to do that, that amount of time is sufficient. That's done. You're finished with that. You've rejected all of that to accept this inheritance in God. You have stopped thinking about the fleshly things. You've stopped committing yourself to the lusts of men. You no longer care about those things. Those things have no value to you anymore. Because what you desire is to do the will of God. And so however much time you spent in the flesh doing those things, whatever that time in the past in your life, it's enough. It's sufficient. It's done. It's gone. There's no reason to go back to it. Do you remember back in chapter 2, he made the point that we conduct ourselves in fear, knowing, verse 18 of chapter 1, knowing that you were not redeemed with perishable things like silver and gold from what? From your futile way of life inherited from your forefathers. You see, that life, that sinful life, that fleshly life that he now describes as all of these things, as pursuing a course of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, idolatries, all of those things were a futile way of life. They were valueless. They had no profit for you. But you've been purchased out of that life. And so whatever amount of time you spent in the past, that's enough. Commit the rest of the time in the flesh to the will of God. That's what you've committed to. That's that good pledge of a good conscience. That's that focus on the spirituality, the focus on the eternal being, not just the physical being that loves all these fleshly things. Because no matter what happens, all this fleshly stuff is going to stop when you die, isn't it? I mean, you think of all the people that really dedicate their life to this kind of lifestyle. You know, I had friends in college that, I mean, their whole focus was the next beer or the next party or the next woman or the next whatever that would satisfy them or perceive to satisfy them physically. And you know what? They never did. They were never satisfied physically. There's always more. There's always that desire for more. And so he's saying one who has decided and one who has finally achieved the perspective that I'm going to hold on to my spiritual life, regardless, even if it causes me to go through suffering, sees that sinful life for what it is, a futile way of living. It has no profit. The only thing that has value is my relationship with God. The only thing that has value is doing God's will, because in doing what's right, He's going to take care of me into eternity, for eternity. You follow?
You think we could use this verse here for someone that has that attitude of, oh, I've done such bad things that God wouldn't accept me?
Well, I mean, he's not talking about the potential to forgive. I mean, he mentions baptism saves you, but the contrast here isn't that these people are profoundly evil enough that they can still be saved. I mean, these aren't some of the more abominable sins that we read about in Scripture, but certainly just because you are one of these people that you used to carry out this course of sensuality and lust doesn't mean that you can't turn your life around and now dedicate it to doing the will of God and understand that He'll take care of you. I think there are maybe some stronger passages to make the point that you're trying to make. I think of lists like, at one time you were like these, talking about homosexuals and liars and murderers. I think those would be stronger passages to go to. If God can forgive those, He can certainly forgive you. But the point that he's making here is just, if you're willing to make that switch from thinking fleshly to thinking spiritually, commit yourself to doing the will of God, in the end, that's no longer that futile way of life. Now, I didn't see this until just the other day, and while we're here, since we mentioned it back in chapter 1, verse 18, I want to make the point, because honestly, Neriah is the one that brought it up in his sermon. And shamefully, I never made the direct connection before. But notice in verse 18, he said, you were bought back with the precious blood of Christ from your futile way of life, inherited from your forefathers. That's that word. Now, in chapter 1, he had just talked about all of these beautiful things about our inheritance and how profitable that inheritance is. And he contrasted it with the inheritance that they received from their forefathers, which was futile, had no value. And so I would make a direct connection between the word inheritance in chapter 1, verse 4, and the word inherited in chapter 1, verse 18. That's the contrast that he's making. I actually drew a line across, mine are from page to page, but I actually drew a line across the margin to get it there. That's really the point that he's making, and he's remaking it here late in chapter, or the beginning of chapter 4, that futile way of life, you now see it to be futile. So whatever amount of time you spent in that futile way of life is enough. There's no reason to go back to it. It's going to value you nothing. And you already understand that. You've already allowed yourself to be purchased out of that way of life. Well, why did you do that? Because you had a long-term view of your life. You see things, you see the true value of life is now to lead us into eternity, not to get drunk and deal with the lusts of men. That's going to be temporal, and no matter what happens, that's going to be temporary. That's only, I mean, let's say that you decide to stay in this lifestyle of the lust for men. It's only going to last you till you die. And now you understand that there's something beyond that has more value. Now, go ahead.
These people have seen that in sin there's nothing of value, but
Yeah.
in God the value never ends.
Exactly. And that's why, if you're willing to take that to the point where you're willing to suffer, sin no longer has that draw over you. You know, that course of sensuality that you used to pursue, notice he says, having pursued, chased after, a course of sensuality. Now, this is a different word than 3:10, by the way, for pursued. Or 3:11, seek peace and pursue it. This is a different word for pursue. But let's say for a second that you used to have this lifestyle where you pursued this course of sensuality. And sensuality is the idea of, this word is a lack of self-constraint. It means to involve yourself in conduct that violates all the bounds of what is socially acceptable, according to BDAG. It's simply about feeding your flesh.
What verse?
In verse 3, where he says, having pursued a course of sensuality. This word just means to do whatever feels good, whether society accepts it or not. Now, we know in this culture, certainly at this time, especially Roman culture, the orgies, the drinking parties, that idea of whatever, just do whatever feels good. That's this word. And they were pursuing a course of that. Now, pursuit is that idea of chasing after, but it's the chasing after the way of that, the journey, the course of that lifestyle. Where is that course going to lead? Well, the course they were pursuing leads to these sensualities, these lusts, this drunkenness. That's the road they're running down. They want to end up with these fleshly desires. And he says lusts, and we've looked at the word lust before. It's simply an unhealthy desire for something, a desire for something forbidden. In our culture, we always think of lust as a sexual desire, but that's not all it is. That's certainly part of it, but it's any unhealthy desire for something forbidden would be the idea behind this word lusts.
So anyhow.
Huh?
Speaking out loud, sir.
It's all right. And drunkenness. Oinophlegia. Overflowing with wine. This lifestyle is just about overflowing with wine. Constantly drunk. Constantly drinking more. And then you have two words that are actually pretty difficult to translate because they don't occur very often. You've got carousing and drinking parties. This idea of carousing, according to BDAG, is excessive feasting, impure feasts with drunkenness and sensuality. The best thing I can associate it to, and not from personal experience, but just from what you see on television, spring break. This in our culture now, with what these college kids do at spring break, it's just one massive party of drunkenness and lusting and sensuality and sexual energy, and I mean that's just all it's for. It seems to be. I even think so often of many New Year's Eve parties that I've heard about, where it's just about getting hammered from the time you get there, and whatever goes, you know? Just doing whatever comes along. That's this idea of carousing. is just that those parties that are just about, I think an example that would probably fit this is the one that we just heard about up in Fort Collins. Did you guys hear about the one that was just 2 nights ago? 400 people in a neighborhood. The police finally showed up and turned the music off, and it turned into a riot. They started throwing bottles at the police and breaking cars and setting things on fire and doing all kinds of stuff. This party was just totally out. It was in the street. I mean, they showed pictures in a neighborhood where the streets and the yards are packed wall to wall with people just getting drunk and doing whatever they wanted to. To me, that's this idea of carousing. Yeah.
I pulled up BDAG on that word, and it also, and this cuts close to home. I don't like it. But anyway, not just drinking, but also over excessive eating. Like, yeah. That's what I've been sitting here thinking about.
Yeah, it is that idea of excessive feasting.
Or like the Rio buffet in Las Vegas. There's like literally 9 full buffets, and you just go from one to the other, and it used to be awesome, but
yeah.
I wouldn't look at it that way now.
Well, now, a little moderation here. Did you go to those things to the point where you puke and go back to get more? I mean, that...
I would have.
Okay, all right. I mean, that is really that excessiveness of this kind of thing. I mean, just eating till you're full is one thing, but that idea of that's the whole purpose of this is just to feed your body. I just want more. And we hear about these people that used to actually make themselves throw up so they could go back and eat more food. Especially in Roman culture, they had vomitoriums. They had places that were designed where you would go from the orgy and the feast and use a feather and shove it down your throat and puke so that you now had more room in your body to go back to the feasting to eat more stuff and do more things.
It's like Hunger Games.
It is much like that kind of thing.
That sounds
and so that's this level. Now, we all make our own applications of that, but he is talking about having a disconnected view of what that's for. I mean, food is to sustain our bodies, not to get to the point where that's all we think about, and that's just what we're there for, is to engorge ourselves and feel the pleasure of that. That's not really what it's for.
Well, I can't help but think about New Orleans and those stupid Mardi Gras.
Yeah, that would be another example of
lollipops and stuff like that. What would that fall under?
What?
Something about lollipop.
That's
tame compared to Carnival, though. Really.
Well, they throw and exchange beads, and they eat each other's lollipops or whatever. I don't know. They do all kinds of weird stuff. What would that fall under?
That would be this word, this carousing. Actually, both of these words. Komos is carousing, and potos is this idea of drinking parties. I think both of those would be involved in that kind of thing. And just that, that lust and the sensuality of those kinds of environments. I mean, they exchange beads because girls, flash their chests, and that's this idea of just everything about sensuality and lust. It's just about those animal desires, and nothing else constrains that. And once nothing constrains that, what are the limits? Well, there aren't any. Why? Because they're thinking fleshly. And that's the contrast that Peter's trying to make. You don't think fleshly anymore. You don't think that way. You aren't involved in whatever time you spent doing any of that in your life is enough. You've moved on. In essence, in our modern vernacular, you would say you've evolved beyond that, right? I mean, you've grown to a deeper knowledge of that. Now, to see that was a futile way of life, where was that going to lead you? I'm going to play it straight up. Long before I was a Christian, I had a roommate in college who was heavy into certain kinds of drugs, like to take pills. And I wasn't into any of that kind of stuff, but he used to take downers. And he would take these pills to the point where he would just literally pass out. He went on a date one time, and a girl actually opened the car door and pushed him out onto the curb and closed the door and drove away. And he woke up in that gutter 2 hours later. Now, he's lucky no police officers found him. But to him, that was a good evening. And the next night, he would just do it again. I mean, that's all his life was involved in, was that whatever felt good to him physically, and he had no spiritual perspective whatsoever. And so what Peter's saying here is whatever's past is past. Whatever you were involved in before, whatever you used to, whatever course of fleshly desires you used to chase, it's done. It's over. There's nothing of value there. There's no profit in any of that. So why would you give up this inheritance that you have in order to return to that? You wouldn't. At least shouldn't. And so you'd be willing to suffer in flesh because your perspective of those sins now is that it's gross. I mean, it's disgusting what I used to do because it separates me from God. And it harmed my spirituality and it jeopardized my eternity. That's gross. Well, there was a time when they didn't see it as being gross, did they? They thought it was great. So it's this mind shift that has to occur in us where we stop thinking fleshly and we start seeing things in a spiritual way. The last word that he uses here is these abominable idolatries. And this phrase together is that wanton rites of fornication and anything that has become an idol. In this particular culture, this would include all the temple prostitutes and all of that kind of environment. They actually believed that going to a temple and having sex with the temple prostitutes was a way of honoring that god and worshiping that particular god. Well, really, it was a fleshly thing, wasn't it? And so it was an abominable idolatry. It violated all decency, but it was something that was being worshipped. It was something that you were doing so much of your life, you had lifted it up to that idol level. It was what you were focused on. It was what you dedicated yourself to. And so when you're in verse 3, just after you go in verse 3, step back into verse 2 for just a second. Remember that one who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin so as to live the rest of their time in the flesh no longer to these lusts of men. You see, there was a time when those lusts were attractive, but not any longer. Now, you live for the will of God. I wanted to see something I didn't look at. Yeah, but Allah, the strong adversative, but for the will of God. It's not for the lusts of men, but Allah, that strong contrast for the will of God. Now, he said that the time was sufficient for you to have carried out these desires in your life, to, having pursued the wrong course. Verse 4, in all of this, they, who's the they?
The one still doing this junk.
Yep, the desires of the Gentiles, they, the people that are still involved in this stuff. In all of this, they are surprised that you do not run with them into the same excesses of dissipation, and they malign you. This is one of the peer pressure things that we talk about. There's still people from the past, whatever folks you used to hang around with in the past, you used to participate in these things with them. You used to be part of this course of sensuality and these lusts and this drunkenness, and you've left that, right? You've changed your perspective into a spiritual perspective, but not everybody's come with you. There's a whole group of people that know you that are surprised that you don't run with them anymore. Now, it's interesting that this word to run together is the idea of flocking together. You don't flock together with these people anymore. Why? Well, mainly because you have a different view of brotherhood now. Remember that idea that has shifted when we obeyed the gospel, that love, the brotherhood? You know, there was probably a time when your drinking buddies were your brothers, right? We're brothers. But not anymore. You don't see them as brothers. You see them as enemies almost. Those are the folks that are trying to drag you away from God. You now see the church, those that are in Christ, as your brothers. And so these folks are really surprised that you don't flock together with them anymore. Now I have to tell a story on my count. There was a time in my life, long before I was a Christian, where I maybe wasn't as far as some of these words say, but I hung around with some guys and we partied. And we partied a lot. And I ran into one after I had become a Christian. He was a business guy here in town, and we just ran into each other. I hadn't seen him in 15 years, 20 years. Ran into him in a store, and we decided to get together for lunch. And we met for lunch, and he was like, 2 beers. It's time for old times. I was like, no, sorry, I don't do that. What do you mean you don't do that? He's like, I don't drink. Oh, come on. Yes, you do. Do you know who you're talking to here? How many times in the desert were we out there just slamming them back? It's like, well, a lot back then, but I don't do that anymore. I'm a Christian now, and I just don't do that. Oh, come on. You can't have changed that much. And there was this surprise in him that I wasn't willing to run back to that old way of life from my youth and go to this bar and get hammered with him. Now, that gave me an opportunity to talk to him about the gospel. Now, he didn't agree. He maligned me before things were over. What, you're too good now? So, see, that's the problem with you Christians, is you think you're better than everybody else. So it has nothing to do with being better than you. It has to do with serving my God. It has to do with doing what God wants me to do, and I don't believe God wants me to do that anymore. And so it has nothing to do with thinking I'm better, or I just don't do some of those things anymore that I used to. Yeah, you goody good, and you get that pressure. Well, that's exactly what he's talking about here. Now, it's interesting. He says that they do not run into the same excesses of dissipation. Now, this word, I actually got in an argument with Dan about this word in California, because it showed up in Titus as well. But the word here is asotia. It's that idea. The root here is sozo. The root here is saved, with an alpha negative. And it's that idea of, it's translated as reckless abandon or debauchery, but the core of the word is about not being saved. I mean, when you really break this word down, it's the unsaved. I mean, that's literally what the word is. Now, maybe it came to mean more than that, or it had a more specific meaning at this point in time, but if we take that root core idea, they're surprised that you do not run with them into the same unsaved condition that they're in. Now, they don't see themselves as unsaved. But from a spiritual perspective, we do now, don't we? We see that situation because we're not thinking fleshly anymore. We're no longer living for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. And we're not going to participate in that unsaved behavior. And when we don't do that, they're going to persecute us. They're going to malign us. They malign you. They speak evil against you. See, that's one of the suffering things that we deal with, isn't it? Is that we have to be willing to suffer. And this is where a lot of folks will say, 1 beer's not going to hurt anything. He's an old buddy. I don't want him to think I'm a goody-goody. I don't want him to think I'm a Jesus freak. I don't want, I'll have a couple of beers with him. Could it really be that bad? Besides, the Bible doesn't say that we can't have social drinking and we start to justify all that, don't we? We start to make excuses for that behavior, and we fall back into that fleshly thinking. I'm more interested in my fleshly relationship with this guy than I am my spiritual relationship with the Father. But we need to hold on to that. See, that time is, you've spent enough time doing that. You spent enough time not thinking about your relationship with God. Now, you've got a relationship with Him. He's watching over you. He's protecting you. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous. His ears attend to your prayer. But if you're not careful, the face of the Lord will be against those who do evil. You follow? And so, this pressure that we get from people, they speak evil of us. But, verse 5, but they will give an account to Him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. See, they're going to give an account for the fact that they're still living in this course of sensuality and lust and drunkenness. We now see that, don't we? One of my favorite psalms is Psalm 73. Mainly because Asaph at some point he's just whining. He sees that the rich and the wealthy are getting away with everything. They're getting richer. It seems like their life is so easy. And he even says, and I was envious. And it almost caused my foot to slip. I mean, I see that the evil seem to be winning. And those of us that are striving to be righteous with God seem to be losing. But then he says, until I entered the sanctuary of God, and there I perceived their end. You see, that's the perspective that Peter's talking about. We recognize that these folks that malign us are going to stand in judgment. And God is ready to judge the living and the dead. He's ready. If we go back to James, the judge is standing right at the door, right? He's watching what we do. And he could come at any minute. What do you want to get caught doing? It's better, if God should will it so, that you suffer for doing what's right rather than suffer for doing what's wrong. You see, they're going to suffer for doing what's wrong. Ultimately. Because the judge is going to see them. And he's going to judge the living and the dead. Those that are still living in that lifestyle. And those that have died. Chasing after that course of sensuality. In essence, Peter is saying here, they speak evil against you because you won't participate with them. Let them. Let them say whatever they want. They're going to give an account to God for what they are doing, and God will take care of it. Don't engage them. God is the judge of all men, both the living and the dead. And He's going to take care of them. You continue to focus on doing what's right. Remember verse 2. You've committed yourself to living the rest of the time in the flesh for the will of God, not for the lusts of men. Why? Because we see that inheritance as precious, something to hold on to. We're not going to give that up for a bunch of jerks who are going to just talk bad about us. It's not worth it. For the gospel has, for this purpose, been preached, even to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in spirit according to the will of God. Okay, now let's connect this all the way back to the rabbit chase with Noah, because I think that's exactly what he's doing. The gospel has for what purpose been preached?
Take the folks will wake up, see the physical for what it is, put their mind on the spiritual, and their whole lives will be now spent spiritually focused.
Absolutely. The gospel's purpose is to separate the righteous from the unrighteous. Those that are going to obey versus those who are going to be disobedient. In Noah's time, you had 8 people who obeyed. God took care of them. And judged the rest of the world with water. You follow? Same thing is going to be true with us. The purpose of the gospel is to divide. Straight up. You know, there's a whole group of folks out there that say we've got to be more accepting. We've got to be less divisive. We've got to have more of a unity and be more welcoming. But the truth of the matter is the purpose of the gospel is to divide the righteous from the wicked. Those that are willing to give up the lusts of men and live for the will of God. That's the dividing line. You know, when you go through the Gospels, especially in Matthew, some in Mark, you see how many times Jesus preached and then there was a division that occurred among the people. I mean, that's what the gospel does, is it separates those. Now, notice he says, for the gospel has for this purpose been preached, even to those who are dead. Who are even those that are dead?
It's got to be spiritually.
The people in Noah's time.
See, I think he's going back to the people of Noah's time. He even preached that same gospel message going all the way back then, when Jesus in spirit went and made proclamation to those.
Let me clarify my answer.
Okay?
It's not to dead people in purgatory. It's to people alive,
Right.
but are spiritually dead, whether now or the days of Noah.
Right. And those dead people were those that were disobedient in Noah's time. Those dead people are the same ones that are still chasing this course of sensuality and lust and drunkenness. Though they are to, notice what it says, though they are judged in flesh as men. Now, this is the same construction that we saw in chapter 1, verse 18. And I think he's still using that instrumental concept of the dative. By means of flesh. Though they are judged by means of flesh as men. You see, when people malign us for not running into the same excesses of dissipation, they judge us in flesh as men. They judge us by means of flesh. So it's that though they are judged in flesh as men, they may live in spirit to the will of God. See, the purpose of the gospel is to help us realize that even though men judge us in flesh, they may persecute us, they may malign us and say all kinds of evil against us. They may even, beat us up or try to kill us. The gospel's purpose is so that we will live according to Spirit. We will live by means of the Spirit according to the will of God, regardless of being judged in flesh as men. See, I don't care about what men say about me, because I'm following the gospel, and the gospel has taught me that this former way of lust, this former way of life that was living for the lusts of men, verse 2, in all of this lust and drunkenness and carousing, verse 3, none of that has any value anymore. I'm going to commit myself to live the rest of my time in the flesh according to the will of God. See, the gospel taught me that. That was the purpose that the gospel has been preached. It was preached that way in Noah's time. It was preached that way in Peter's time. It's preached that way today. That's the purpose of the gospel. It's to teach people that it doesn't matter what the world says about you. You will be judged in flesh as men, by men. Because their fleshly thinking, and I think we've all seen it at some point. I know a lot of times people do. You run into people who aren't Christian, and when they find out you're Christian, they have a few things to say about the Christian way of living and how ridiculous it is and how, they're judging us in flesh as men. They see things in a fleshly way. They judge by means of flesh. But the gospel is so that we will live by means of spirit according to the will of God. I don't care what happens fleshly. What I care about is my spiritual life. What's going to get me through to the end. And so he says in verse 7, the end of all things is near. You're close. The finish line isn't too far away. Don't blow it now, in essence. You follow? Don't give in to this judgment of men. Don't give in to this judgment in the flesh. They're going to say some terrible things about you. They're going to point swords at you. They're going to persecute you. They're going to cause you to suffer. But hold fast to that life in the Spirit, according to the will of God, because the end of all things is near. Therefore, be of sound judgment and sober for the purpose of prayer. Now, the New American Standard adds the word sober spirit just about every time that it's used in the book. Yeah, it does it every time. Chapter 1, verse 13, keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you. We see it here. We also see it in chapter 5, verse 8, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. I think they've added that to get us beyond the idea of drunkenness. The word itself just means to remain focused, remain sharp. Don't do anything that dulls your senses. Now, certainly part of that would be don't drink alcohol because that dulls your senses. But it's a word that's much broader than that. Don't do it. I found one lexicon one time that says anything that lacks fuzziness. Sober is the absence of fuzziness. I like that idea. You know, we need to stay sharp, focused. And that's what he's saying here. Be of sound judgment and sober. Now, compared to what he just said in verse 3, with all the drunkenness and sensuality and all that, I think there's a lot of this that is, stay away from alcohol. I mean, all of those things, that sensuality, that lust, the drunkenness, the carousing, the idolatries, all take our focus away from our spiritual. They make us drunk. Now, not just drunk on wine, but drunk with lust, drunk with sexuality, drunk with food, drunk with idolatry, drunk with power. And the point is, be of sound judgment. Keep your head about you. Don't lose focus right here at the end. Now, again, this should connect us back to one of our 5 imperatives in the front. He had said in 1:13, keep sober, fixing your hope completely on the grace to be brought at the revelation of Jesus Christ. He's restating that now. Be sober for the purpose of prayer. Now, why for the purpose of prayer?
Because you have to have a mindset when you're in prayer. You have to be focused on the Lord in prayer. And I don't know if that you can do that when you're drunk. How do you do that when you're drunk?
Well, I think it's beyond drunk.
When you're focused on anything else but the Lord.
When you have that fleshly mindset, your connection with God is going to suffer. Remember, chapter 3, verse 12. For the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer. You remember he told husbands to live in their wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, showing them honor as fellow heirs of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. And so I think it's that idea that the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. And if we're doing evil, our prayer life is going to suffer, and God's willingness to hear our prayer is going to suffer. And guess what? If I'm suffering, if I'm trying to walk this Christian walk in the face of the kind of persecution that Peter's been talking about, I need the power of prayer, don't I? I need that connection, that strength that I draw from God. And if my judgment isn't sound and my behavior is not sober, my prayer life is going to suffer. Now, the word "the purpose of" really isn't in this verse. It should be italicized, added by the translators. It really just says, be sober for prayer.
It really says what?
Be sober for prayer. It's actually ace. Be sober into prayer. because the end of all things is near. Now, is that true?
Relatively speaking.
Oh, it's over when your life is over for you anyway.
But I mean, this was written 2,000 years ago. All things haven't come to an end yet, have they?
No. But, again, relatively speaking, eternity compared to 80 some odd years on earth, it's not even to be compared.
Exactly. And in the face of persecution, notice what he said back in verse 2 of chapter 4. You're making the commitment to live the rest of the time in the flesh. How much is the rest of the time in the flesh? For everybody, it's going to be different. They could walk out of their house right now and the Roman guards could come and slay them in the street. And guess what? The rest of their time in the flesh was a few hours. They may also survive the persecution and have another 80 years to live. But the end of all things is near. Eternity is right around the corner. Doesn't matter how far away it is from you, you're closer to it today than you were yesterday. Don't lose sight of the finish line, right? Fix your hope completely on the return of Christ, because it's closer now than it's ever been. And so he says, verse 8, above all, keep fervent in your love for one another. What does that connect us with? What, Nariah?
You just said something about being fervent in prayer.
Okay, but what else does it connect us with that's bigger than that?
122.
122, one of our 5 imperatives that he structures the whole book around. Fervently love one another from the heart, right? Now he says here at the end, in the face of the concept that the end of all things is near and be sound in judgment, keep fervent in your love for one another. Keep fervent. Why is that so important? Because love covers a multitude of sins. Continue to help one another. Be willing to sacrifice. This is the agape love. Be willing to give yourself up one for another. Because that, if you're willing to do that, guess what? You are willing to suffer in flesh. And if you are willing to suffer in flesh, then you have ceased the influence of sin in your life. This type of love covers a multitude of sins. So he says, be hospitable to one another without complaint. He's going to go through a series of things that are going to demonstrate this love. You see, again, it's not enough to just say that you love. You've got to be overflowing. That's what that idea of keep fervent. Overflowing in love for one another.
This sin, is coverage of sins is sins against you by your brethren?
He doesn't
Or
say.
Sin in general.
Sin, the way he's been using sin is that which separates us from God.
Right. The sins he was mentioning before.
Yeah, I don't think he's just talking about those sins in verse 3. I think he's talking about more the concept of sin from 4:1. The idea that if we are willing to do this, if we continue to remain focused on one another, loving one another, putting others before self, that's going to cover a multitude of sins. It's the same idea that James 5:20 said. He who helps turn a sinner from the error of his ways will cover a multitude of sins. It's actually the same phrase. Now, this word covers is connected to the word reveal that Peter's been using throughout. Reveal means to uncover. This means to actually cover. So, our sins are covered over when Jesus is revealed, if we have been faithful. But this willingness to love one another and keep fervent covers a multitude of sins. It gets rid of those sins from the standpoint of they're no longer, I think it's the same idea as 4:1. Those are no longer attractive to us anymore. We've gotten rid of them. We've done away with them. They're covered and gone. But he says, be hospitable to one another without complaint. See, that's part of loving one another. This word hospitable literally is stranger love. Have stranger love for one another. The idea of keep an open door. Hospitable is about being willing to share what you have with someone else. And that certainly was important in a time of persecution because there aren't many people that were going to give them much help. And so Christians need to be hospitable to one another. They need to be willing to help, open their door, share what they have, and to do that without complaint. Oh, great. Scott wants to come over and spend 3 days with us because he's got no place to stay. I suppose we should. I mean, he's a brother. I suppose I guess we can go. I guess we can deal with it for just a few days. It's not going to be the end of the world, Well, that's not being hospitable. That's complaining, whining. We need to do that without complaint. We need to say, brother, you don't have a place to stay. You're staying with us. We need to be those people that are hospitable. Christians couldn't stay in inns because they were immoral and dangerous. The inns tended to be the brothels and the places where the sins of chapter 4, verse 3 were taking place. That those lusts and the drunkenness and the carousing and all that, those were taking place in the inns. And so Christians couldn't stay there. Their worldly friends didn't want them because of the ridicule and the persecution they may get. Plus, if they are the people from verse 4, they're speaking evil of the Christians because you don't want to party with them anymore. They're not going to let you in their house. You think you're better than they are. You're not staying with me. And Christians needed a place to find shelter and to worship together. And so it was important for people to open their homes to one another, to fervently love one another, to show that self-sacrifice and say, if the Romans see you coming into my home, I could be in trouble. But you're a brother. I don't care about the Romans. You're staying with me, right? I'm not going to worry about them judging me in the flesh. I'm more worried about doing what God's will is. And God's will says, you're a brother and you need a place to stay. And I am to love the brotherhood, right? He's commanded that at least twice in the book. So you're staying with me. I don't care what danger it brings. I'm not worried about that. You can't sleep on the street. Come on in. You're staying with us. You follow? Okay. Well, we didn't get as far as I was hoping we would get, but we will deal with that on, what is today? Today's Monday. We'll deal with that on Monday.
That stranger love may be an example of when Lot wanted the guests to stay with him.
Sure.
Opened his doors up to him.
Yeah. You think, the one that strikes me is Philip. Philip watched Paul murder Stephen. And yet, later in the book of Acts, he actually has him in his home. And he stays with, Paul actually stays with Philip. He invites him into his home. It takes a lot of forgiveness, but it takes a lot of hospitality, too. To say, I know who he used to be, but I don't believe he is that anymore. He's a brother. I love the brotherhood. He's going to stay with us. Pretty neat idea.